Hello and welcome to Chapter 11 Notes. And so in this chapter we're going to be talking about variance analysis and standard costing. We'll deal with this in terms of our direct materials, our direct labor, and also our overhead variances, okay? So when we go ahead and we're going to talk about some terminology and concepts here in this lecture video, and then we'll start jumping in to calculating out variances and standard costs. So when we talk about a standard, we could say it's a benchmark or norm for performance. So if we were to think about making pizzas, for example, that's the way I often think about it. We could say there's a direct material standard for making a pizza. We should say, you know what, we use a pound, I'll say a cheese pizza, pound of dough, a jar of tomato sauce, and a pound of cheese. Those are the direct materials. Quantity variance, direct materials quantity. So that's how much we should use to make one pizza in terms of direct materials. That would be a quantity standard for making the pizza. Then we can also say, you know what, it should take us a half an hour to make a pizza from the time that we actually cook it to actually assembling all the ingredients and tossing the dough and all that kind of stuff. And we could say it should take us a half an hour. That would be a quantity standard in terms of direct labor. We can also have price standards in terms of direct labor and in terms of direct materials. We could say, you know what, we should pay $10 an hour for making a pizza. So in that case, if it takes a half an hour, the labor cost should be $5. We can also think in terms of a price standard for our direct materials. So we could say, you know what, it should take a pound of dough, one jar of tomato sauce, and 1 pound of cheese to make one cheese pizza. And each one costs $1. So that means a pound of dough costs $1, a pound of cheese costs $1, the jar of tomato sauce also costs $1. So that means it should take us $3 in direct materials to make a pizza. So thinking about that so far, we have $10 an hour to take a half an hour, so that's $5 in labor costs. And we could say $3 in materials costs, so that's $3.50. And then we could allocate out overhead, maybe 50 cents or $1, let's just say $1 per labor hour. If it takes us a half an hour, then we add another 50 cents. So that should come out to $4 to make one pizza, because I allocated the overhead based on the direct labor hours, and it was a half an hour at $1 an hour, so that's 50 cents right there, and we can add that to the labor cost and to the materials cost to give us the $4. Okay? So to kind of summarize the example that I just went over, we can have a direct materials quantity standard, we can have a direct materials price standard, we can have a direct labor quantity standard, which we call labor efficiency, okay? And then we can have a labor price standard, which we call labor rate. So what we can do is when I get to that total cost for making a pizza, I could say this should be the standard cost. This should be the norm. It should cost us $4 to make one pizza after we push that overhead. And then what we could do is we could say, well, all right, it should cost us $4 to make a pizza, and instead we calculate out, well, what's the actual cost for making a given pizza for the last month or the last accounting period, and it was $5. Well, that's unfavorable, right? Because our standard cost, our actual cost is higher than our standard cost, and that's a bad thing. So when we talk about the difference between the standard and then the budget, the standard is the cost for making a single unit. The budgeted would be the total cost, okay, for making all the units at the standard cost. So you could say we're going to make 10 pizzas and each one costs us $40, so we should have $40 of budgeted cost. So kind of like what I was talking about over here, just looking at this example, continuing this on, we can have our direct materials is 2 pounds at $5 a pound, so that's $10 right over there. We have 3 hours of direct labor at $10 an hour, so we have $30 of direct labor. Then we have our manufacturing overhead at $5 per hour times the 5 gives, times the 3 over there. The 3 hours times the 5 gives us the 15. We add up all these, and our standard cost for making one unit would be $55, and if we made 10 units, we would multiply the 55 times the 10 to give us a budgeted cost of $550. So that's the difference between budgeted and standard. Budgeted is the total, standard is for a given unit. Okay? So when we talk about how to actually develop these standard costs, we can develop our standard quantity and price materials in terms of engineering plans. We can have price lists provided by suppliers. In terms of our standard quantity and rate for labor, How could we do that? We could do some time and motion studies by industrial engineers. And of course, if you're working in government contracting, I'm sure you've seen this before, that the government will set certain labor rates, and then that's passed down to how much we will actually pay our employees in terms of an hourly rate. Okay. We can talk about standards in terms of two different categories. We can say there's ideal standards and then attainable standards. Ideal standards would be that nobody ever messes up, nobody takes a smoke break. Well, that's not very realistic, and so what we want to think about is more attainable standards where we do actually allow times for rest and time for defects and cleaning up issues, okay? So that would be more attainable standards. When we talk over here in terms of our variance analysis and our standard cost variance, so when we talk about a standard cost variance, that's going to be the difference between the standard cost and then the actual cost. That was kind of that example that I was given before. If we say it's $4 to make a pizza, that's our standard cost, and we go through and we do some calculations, we find out it's $5, well, that's unfavorable. And then we can break down that overall variance into a direct labor, direct materials, and then overhead variance, okay, and see what caused that overall variance, okay? And that's what I was saying right over here, is that we can break down this overall variance into its components of direct materials, direct labor, and then manufacturing overhead, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and continue on the next page right over here. What needs to be included for our direct material standards? So when we have a standard price per unit, that's going to include our specified quality of materials, any discounts for quantity purchases, discounts for early payment, and then in terms of, we'll also include our freight costs, our receiving and handling costs. We talk about the standard quantity, what should it be, our bill of materials, but then we do get into, these are some of the attainable standards right over here. So we're going to say, you know what, there's some waste, and that maybe we had some rejects, and we have to consider that, okay? So you can see right over here, by when we're developing the standard quantity for direct materials, we are including, we're basically developing attainable standards, okay? So we look at over here and we say what needs to be included for our direct labor standards. We have our hourly wage rates, any fringe benefits and employment taxes. Then we look over here, what we say right over here is we might want to develop a single rate for all the employees in a given department. That would simplify things. Obviously, if there's a big variance between different rates, I mean, if you had a manager versus a worker bee employee, you probably wouldn't want to do that because those could be two very different rates. But if the rates are pretty similar between advanced and senior, you may just want to use one single rate just to simplify things, because it will add another layer of complexity and it may not be worth it to do that, okay? So that's what I'm saying over here. You might just want to use one single standard rate to simplify the use of standard costs, okay? We talk about our standard hours over here, the standard hours per unit. How would we figure that out? How would we develop this? And again, some of this in terms of how we develop these, I'm not going to test you on. I'm going to be giving that number to you, but I think a little bit of background here will be useful. So we would say it should take us like this is what I was talking about earlier, it should take us half an hour to make a pizza. And that includes any breaks and cleanup time. And then to set up to get the oven heated up, okay? And then if you had any allowance for rejects, you'd want to include that. And so again, this gets back into attainable standards right over here, okay? Then when we talk about our overhead rates, we would want to have a predetermined overhead rate. Remember, we developed that by taking our estimated total overhead divided by our estimated allocation base, okay? And then whatever the cost driver is, that's the way we would allocate out the overhead. So in the case of, back on the first page of your notes, we could see it, we did it based upon the number of hours. Now we get into why do we want to determine price and quantity standards separately. Now, this is important, is because different managers could be responsible for buying units, and a different manager could be responsible for using those units. And those two activities could occur at two different points in time. So if we think about in terms of purchasing the raw materials and then using the raw materials, and we could say this would be a purchasing manager, for example, and this would, in terms of using the raw materials, it would be the production line supervisor. So if there's two different people, you want to calculate these two standards differently so that you can figure out who to hold accountable. If we have an unfavorable direct materials price variance, we might want to go to the purchasing manager. But if we had an unfavorable direct materials quantity variance, we might want to go to the production line supervisor. Okay, so that's why we want to develop these separately. Okay, and I would also argue it gives you a finer level of detail. I mean, you just know at a finer level what is causing your overall variance. What is making your costs higher? Is it the materials? Is it the materials that you used, or is it the materials that you paid for? Was it a labor rate issue that you had, or was it a labor efficiency issue? You know, having that level of detail will help you as a manager make better decisions. Okay? We talk about differences between standard prices and actual prices and standard quantities. In actual quantities, those are called variances, and we will calculate those for direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. We look over here on the next page, and we can say we have a general model over here for our variance analysis. We're going to take our price variance is going to be our actual quantity times our actual price minus our actual quantity times our standard price, and you could just do algebra to factor out the AQ times AP minus SP. When we look at our quantity variance over here, it's the actual quantity times the standard price minus the standard quantity times the standard price, or you can use algebra to factor out the SP. Now when we talk about AQ over here versus AQ over here, we have two different AQs when we're talking about direct materials. Over here, when we talk about direct materials price variance, we're talking about the actual quantity of direct materials that you bought. The actual quantity of materials that you bought. Okay? Over here, we're talking about the actual quantity of materials that you used. Those could be two different numbers, right? You could purchase $10,000 worth of direct materials, but only use $8,000. So what would come over here is we would, let me change that to pounds, 10,000 pounds of direct materials, and you only use 8,000 pounds of direct materials. This would be 8,000, how much you used. This would be 10,000, how much you purchased. Okay? Now, because we're only dealing with cost standards right over here, if the actual cost is greater than the standard, that's a bad thing. It would be a favorable variance if the actual is less than the standard. Now, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be developing the absolute value. We're going to be using the absolute value. So I'm not going to be putting these numbers as negative or positive because that will confuse you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show them as the absolute value, even if it's unfavorable or favorable. It doesn't matter if it's a negative number or positive number. I'll show the absolute value, and then we'll put a U for unfavorable or an F for favorable, depending upon whether it's unfavorable or favorable. Okay? So I'm going to stop this lecture video here and continue with the second lecture video covering the rest of the next few pages. Thank you.